Welcome to U of Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Stephon Alexander, Professor of Physics at Brown University and the President of the National Society of Black Physicists. Alexander is a theoretical physicist specializing in cosmology, particle physics, and quantum gravity. An avid jazz saxophonist, Alexander explores interconnections between music, physics, mathematics, and technology through recordings, performance, teaching, and public lectures. His first book, The Jazz of Physics, The Secret Link Between Music and the Structure of the Universe, was published in 2016. His second book, Fear of a Black Universe, An Outsider's Guide to the Future of Physics, is forthcoming in August. Alexander will give a public talk, What a Scientist Learned from Jazz About Innovation, on April 22, 2021, as a guest of the University of Oregon's Physics Department and the Oregon Humanities Center. Thanks so much, Stephon, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peppis. Or may I call you Paul?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to engage, Oregon, and because when I was in college, I ran cross country, and I went to a small liberal arts college out east, and we call him. He was referred to him as Pre, who was the miler and cross country runner from UO. So anyway, that's just.
Pre is a god in our town. If you could be with us in person, we could take you to Pre's trail where he ran.
That's what I dream of. I want to come out there and run. Whatever little run I can do now, I definitely want to do that. But we worshiped Pre when we were, and our cross country team worshipped him. He's a legend.
You said it. Well, we'll look forward to the day when we can welcome you in the flesh.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So was born in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, the country, and then moved to New York City in 1979 when I was 8 years old, and grew up in the Bronx, New York. I'm pretty much a Bronx boy, Now, in terms of, you mean like academic background?
That's my next question. So,
okay.
What led to your interest in physics? How did you become an academic?
Yeah, I think I give a lot of credit. Obviously to my upbringing. Believe it or not, growing up in the Bronx, I was very hooked, of course, on sci-fi and comic books, Marvel comic books. Everybody wanted to build an Iron Man suit, but also hip hop. The hip hop culture. There was a very innovative, especially when it came down to making the beats and that type of innovation, the digital sampling. I kind of got intrigued by how the in a work what made a sampler work. And that then led me down the rabbit hole of electrons and trying to understand the physics of that. And of course, a high school teacher, Mr. Daniel Kaplan, who encouraged me to go to college and study physics. So I would say those are some of the main things. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Daniel Kaplan. You tell some really fascinating stories about him. He must have been an amazing teacher. Tell us that one story that, the first day you met him, the first day you went to his class. Tell us that story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, during that time, that was 10th grade. And the one thing I have to give my high school, Dewey Clinton, credit for, it's a typical New York City public school. But physics was taught earlier. Physics, I think some schools teach physics. They think physics is hard, so they should teach it last. Physics was taught along with biology, and then chemistry came after. And so as a result, I'm in 10th grade taking our Regents physics, which is typical, bread and butter physics class in the New York public school system. And at that time, to be frank, I was a truant. I was cutting classes and stuff. Really wasn't into school as much as I should be. Had no idea what physics was, and then this guy walks in. He had a little bit of a limp because that's kind of how he walked, and looked a little bit. Had Einstein type of hairstyle, and he walks in, and he walks to the front of the room first, and then he writes this equation, and then everybody gets scared. We're like, whoa, 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 whoa. And then he leaves the front of the room and comes and sits amongst us. Like, so he sits on a desk. So, so now he's amongst the class. We're like, okay. And then he goes into his inside pocket, and we're like, whoa, 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 who's this guy? What's he got in there? And he pulls out a ball. And then he takes the ball and goes, okay, that equation basically encodes everything about this ball, but also the moon. It was actually Newton's laws, but we didn't know it at the time. And he goes, so if I throw this ball up in the air, right, when it gets to the very top, the velocity is 0. What is the velocity when the ball comes back to the bottom? So many students, including myself, at first we were like, oh man, we don't even know how to solve this equation. Like, what's going on here? And then in that moment, like what happened was I just started visualizing the ball going up and down, up and down, up and down. And I just, had intuited and just spontaneously yelled out, the velocity will be, exactly the same as it was when it left your hand. And then this guy gets very excited. He goes, that is that's how a physicist think. You're thinking with your intuition. Anyway, after class ends, he comes up to me, he goes, I would like you to come to my office. He goes, you have the mind of a physicist. And I'm like, of course, I'm truant, right? I'm like this, I'm saying to myself, really, me? Like, I'm smart? Like, it was looking back at it, it's like, if all teachers can be more like this, because a lot of what was going on with me was, and a lot of my classmates, kids growing up in the hood, and like, we're not really thinking this of ourselves. The media and society doesn't portray that about us. So to have a teacher just say something like that was really transformative.
So Mr. Kaplan wasn't just a mentor for you in physics, he was also a mentor for you in music. So tell us about that part of the story.
Yeah, that's the other thing too, because, I grew up in a musical family, and, and I, at the time, did have a saxophone, although I wasn't really, playing it, I wasn't formally practicing and playing the instrument. Mr. Kaplan was also a jazz musician. He was also a composer. And he was both the chairperson, the head of the music department and the science departments at my high school. So he was really one of these people that was comfortable doing and being both. And so when I would go to his office, so his office was the kind of place where he had this huge office, and he had anything to do with music in the office and anything to do with science in the same office. And so that was sort of like a normal thing for me to see, right? He was the first example of a scientist I've seen, right? So for me, it was like, my first interaction with a scientist was somebody that was also a musician, right? So it was like, okay, I'm gonna become that. That's a normal thing, right? Now, having said that, that's not what media and TV and movies and stereotypes are portraying. I was also aware of that too. And so there was a bit of a tension as I progressed along about the music, being a musician and being a scientist. And am I serious enough as a scientist if I'm engaging as my life, if I'm also playing music, or am I really, that tension remained, but Mr. Kaplan served as this courageous soul that, embodied both. It was important that it happened at a young age,
So let's talk a little bit more about this. Your book, The Jazz of Physics, promises to reveal the secret link between music and the structure of the universe. So I have a couple of questions about that. So what is that secret link, and how did you come to discover it?
Yeah, the secret is, it's really funny because the secret, that was a bit of what do you call it, a gimmick to get people to buy the book. So the secret is not really that much of a secret. The secret link really had to do with, and it's not really a secret because it's obvious when you think about it, has to do with vibration, right? It has to do with resonance and the properties of waves. That basically, if you look at like a lot of what modern physics is saying, if you look at like particle physics and the theory of general relativity, you can understand a lot of that physics with just understanding how waves behave and how they interact with each other, and how waves manifest themselves as different presentations of nature, of the physical world. And of course, likewise, a lot of, when we think about sound and, the musical tones and how they come together in an ordered, structured way, and synthesis, right? Like the music of Brian Eno, for example, right? And you can understand that also through the lens of waves and vibration. So that was definitely one link. The other link, of course, had to do with, I think, improvisation. Like, I found that the way that physicists some styles of doing physics had an improvisational nature to it. The path of discovery of, had to do with, these eureka moments had to do with some kind of improvisation. And of course, improvisation is central to jazz music.
So one of the really interesting or terrific things about this book, especially for folks like me who know next to nothing about physics, is your use of analogies to illuminate complicated questions of theoretical physics. So say a little bit about why analogies are so important a tool for you in your work.
Because oftentimes I'm very dumb. No, seriously. Oftentimes, like, I'm really struggling to understand something new that I'm thinking about, or I'm working on, or even remember something that I should know. But so in physics research, right, you're trying to push the boundary of knowledge. It's not just about things that we know already and you're trying to learn it. It's like, you're trying to build on what's known to create something new, or to have a different way of looking at it. Sometimes just a different shift, right? This also happens in other fields. What's your field, Paul?
I'm an English professor.
Right. So I'm sure, again, right? I remember one of the most painful things I had to do in college. I went to Haverford College, and we were all required to take expository writing, and like you had to read all the great books and stuff for an entire year. Faulkner, we had to read Faulkner and like all these great books, right? And I remember we had to do literary criticism. And part of doing that was going and looking at other people's literary criticisms of books. And it was like, wait a minute, for the same book, you had like 15 different perspectives. And so I'm sure similar things happen where part of research is also, you have an object and you providing a completely different shift and perspective on it, right? On something that's known or supposed to be known. So analogies come in for me because, so let's say I'm trying to understand, I don't know, the shape, I don't know, the geometry of this book. And, it has this thickness, has these pages. And I know very little. This is the new thing. I'm some alien. I've come down. I've discovered this object. But in my alien world, I have this cell phone, and I know a gazillion things about this. I know this thing really, really, really well. And the idea of the analogy, the power of analogy, is to say, you know what? Let me imagine that this book is like the thing I understand really well. And then I compare these two things. And I find the places where they really overlap, right? So I use what I know really, really well to understand something in terms of the thing that I know well. That's the analogy making. The thing I don't know really well. And I find that there's so many similarities. Then it gives me a sense of a hook, a way of getting a toehold on the thing that I don't understand. And where the analogy starts to break down is where I start generating interesting questions so I can learn about this thing. And that to me is where it gives you a way in by using things that you know really well and you understand well, and making an analogy making a comparison, right, or a similarity between the thing that you don't understand. And what's left behind is a place to really focus and look for the questions.
So that book that you were just waving around, that's your second book. You've just gotten a copy of that second book, A Fear of a Black Universe, An Outsider's Guide to the Future of Physics. So can you tell us a little bit about the argument of that
The
book?
advertisement there, but I'm very happy about this.
Tell us a little bit about that book, what that book is about.
Well, since I do a very bad job I'm just going to read. Can I read the back description of it? Okay. It says, a cosmologist argues that physics must embrace the excluded, listen to the unheard, and be unafraid of being wrong. In Fear of a Black Universe, Stephon Alexander shows, that's me, that great physics requires us to think outside the mainstream. His approach leads him to three fundamental principles: the principle of invariance, that's basically the principle of symmetry, the quantum principle, and the principle of emergence. Combining them with insights from African, Indian, and Western philosophy, Alexander explores some of physics' greatest mysteries, from the Big Bang to consciousness. Drawing on his experience as a Black physicist, he makes a compelling and empowering case for diversifying science. I don't think I could do better than what my editor wrote.
So let's talk a little bit about that that project, diversifying science. So
Yes.
you're the president of the National Society of Black Physicists. So tell us about that society and the work that it does.
Sure. So the National Society, we call ourselves NSBP. We're going into our 50th anniversary. Was founded in the late 70s. And in a nutshell, it was founded not because, Black physicists wanted to isolate ourselves, but at that time, there were a handful of really powerful physicists who were not Black, who basically went public and said that they don't think African Americans can do physics. They were like people who were pushing more the eugenics thing, that we're genetically incapable of doing these things. Obviously, complete hoax, but anyway, these are powerful people. So, a group of Black physicists got together and decided, well, we have to make sure that we continue to do physics, regardless of maybe how the majority community thinks about us. We have to continue doing our work. And so they started to informally get together and give talks, professional talks, and try to collaborate in research projects together and engage each other's students. And that structure of mentoring and really pushing research and excellence and really supporting the professional lives, as well as the morale of young Black scientists, right, grew into now a 2,000 member society that has, we have people from all over the world as well. I mean, it's mostly an American thing, but we have members from Africa. We have a few in Europe now. And it's mainly, we have an annual meeting every year. And that's actually the NSBP has always functioned as two main things. We have an annual meeting. By the way, membership is open to everyone. Anyone can be a member of NSBP, and we just ask that you support the principle of excellence in science for African Americans in physics, and you get behind supporting that. But we have an annual meeting every year where we all gather from all over the world, and we basically have scientific talks for a couple of days, and we socialize and around, of course, our common love for physics. And it's also a time where one generation plays an active role in mentoring and providing resources and career opportunities and advice for graduate school. So in a nutshell, when I was at Haverford, I was the only Black physics major. Haverford is a small Quaker liberal arts college outside of Philly. And it was a great place for me to study physics. And I had great professors. But there was a need for me, not a need, but I remember that as an 18-year-old, when I went to my first NSBP meeting, I saw other kids that looked like me, professors, like Black physics professors at mostly historically Black universities. It was a way of me realizing that, there were other unicorns out there. And so I was a student, and now I'm the president. And it's all, what we do is all volunteer. It's really a labor of love, because many of us who benefited when we were students, we feel compelled to serve. So a big part of our tradition, NSBP, is that of service. That, you know, success is also a function of service. It's not only about me, and like what have you. Now, NSBP is like any other organization. There are things that we have to pay attention to, and you know, so we are also we pay attention to the the next generation, and one of the things I did in my administration was to expand student leadership and student activity and involvement, and so we have a very active student council. It's and yeah, so that's NSBP in a nutshell.
So thanks so much for telling us about it. It sounds like an amazing organization. I'd like to give you an opportunity now to share any advice that you would have for young Black people who are currently interested in science and physics, whether they're in high school or in college. What would you say to encourage them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that, you know, it's sort of I don't know if it's an elephant in the room, is that, you know, we respond, I think a lot of us, I would say that, you have a lot more in common with Albert Einstein and, and Richard Feynman, some of the greats that you see that we in the media, portrayed in the media, than you would like to imagine. So I think it's really important that young people, and especially young people of color, understand that you don't have to be like, there are stereotypes out there of what a scientist should look like and act like. We see it in TV shows and in movies. That's just noise. I mean, being your true, genuine selves, it's actually the best place where you can bring the best contribution to being a scientist. It has nothing to do with the ways in which the media portrays what a scientist is like. That's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, I mean, like, if I can do it, you can do it, because there's nothing really, I wasn't like, the superstar kid, I went to, Bronx Science, and even in college, I struggled, and I wasn't, right. But I had a passion. I asked a lot of questions. And I in my book, I really talk about that. I talk about basically what science really looks like. There's learning science and there's doing science. And there are many different ways that you can learn science and build competencies and build that skill set. There's not one axis for how that's done. And definitely now with the advent of the internet, and of course, there are all these ways that you can go and like reinforce your knowledge base, but understand that science is not just only about learning it. It's about doing it. It's about creating new science. And I think that I'm not going to be presumptuous, in the jazz of physics, what I show is that, already in certain elements of African-American culture, we're already doing science. We're already innovating. We're already engaging in scientific types thinking. So we don't have to be like anybody else. And, that's, in a nutshell.
Thanks. So you just were saying that, in African-American music, we're already being scientists, we're already innovating. Tell us a little bit about what John Coltrane thought about Albert Einstein. I didn't realize that there was a link between Coltrane and Einstein. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'll tell that story with a story. So I somehow had a sense in the research for my book that Coltrane was doing more than just playing the sax. He was like a scientist with his instrument and with his music. So I luckily came across a conversation, an interaction with David Amram, who is the New York, Hal Bernstein appointed him to be the composer for the New York Philharmonic I think in the 60s. But anyway, he's a multi-instrumentalist, a brilliant composer, right? And I met him and we spoke about Coltrane because he knew Coltrane. They were friends. And he said that, and David Amram also played with Dizzy Gillespie. And so there was a club outside of called Cafe Bohemia in the Village. And during the intermission, Amram comes outside and he sees Coltrane eating a pie. Okay, maybe it was a blueberry pie. And so they talked a lot of music theory shop, right? That's what they did. So because, Coltrane was heavily into music theory, as is evident. So anyway, so they were engaging in their little, their talk. And then Coltrane asked David Amram, hey, what do you think about Einstein? So Amram understood that to me, to say, what do you think about Einstein to Coltrane? And so he asked Coltrane, so what do you think about Einstein? And then he said, Coltrane goes on to reveal like all of this like information about Einstein's theory of relativity, about black holes, about space-time geometry, and light cones, and he's going off about Einstein, Einstein's idea, like an in-depth knowledge. And he goes to Amram, you know what Einstein did for physics? I want to do the same thing for music. Now, fast forward, I discover now this diagram that John Coltrane drew is a hand-drawn diagram as a birthday present to Yusuf Lateef. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, I totally understand what he meant by that, because Einstein, basically, the fundamental lesson we learned from Einstein, his major contribution to modern physics, including relativity, was by looking at nature through the lens of invariance. I change something, I change perspective. What remains unchanged when I do that? Well, the speed of light, if I change frames of reference. Or another word for that is symmetry, like by exploiting and discovering hidden symmetries in nature, he was able to understand why, the underpinnings of how the physical world function, and turned out to work well for actually 4 of the fundamental forces. Well, Coltrane's diagram basically, right? If maybe you'll show it to your viewers. Basically has all of these symmetries and patterns. So it was clear that Train was really, really understood the core concept of Einstein's work. Like, playing with ideas, right? And seeing where it takes you. That's very much, right? The Gedanken experiments of Albert Einstein. That's kind of the spirit of what Coltrane was doing, and that's scientific.
So thanks for that. We're coming to the end of our time. I have just time for one more question. And, it's clear from our conversation and from a number of things you've said that you are, in addition to being a physicist, in addition to being a musician, you are an educator. You're a teacher. So my question is, can you tell me one lesson that you've learned from your students about physics, about the jazz of physics, or about jazz?
Whoa, that's a hard question. Yeah, one of the things I have learned from my students is that I teach a class called the Jazz of Modern Physics, which is a course that is designed because we have RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. So I wanted a class for humanities students who would never take a physics class at Brown to take. But I also didn't want to water anything down. I felt that I was able to teach, I challenged myself and the class to kind of really teach wave mechanics and modern physics, Newtonian physics, all that stuff, without any assumption of the mathematics or a pre-exposure to physics. And one thing I definitely made sure to do was to not give them a final exam, but to give them a final project where they work together in groups. Here's something I learned from my students, was that if you give them something challenging, and if you really let go and like give them, you sort of let them at it, they come back with things that you never dreamt of, and they run away and they do their own thing, and they come back with something that no matter how intelligent you think you are, you're not able to come up with. And that to me is, I mean, I would say that that process is something that I've learned.
Well, Stephon, on that note, which is a lovely note to end on, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. A pleasure too.
I've been speaking with Stephon Alexander, professor of physics at Brown University. He'll give a public talk, What a Scientist Learned from Jazz About Innovation, on April 22nd, 2021, as a guest of the University of Oregon's Physics Department and the Oregon Humanities Center. Thanks so much for watching.